When my son got married, I kept a $90 million trust fund completely secret. My late wife left it to me, and I never breathed a word of it to anyone. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made in my entire 70 years of life, because exactly 7 days after the wedding, his new wife showed up uninvited at my front door with a slick corporate lawyer at her side. What she demanded, and what I eventually discovered, shattered my world. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought my gray hair meant I was defenseless. My name is Walter Merritt. I am 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer. For the last 4 decades, I have made my home in a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of San Antonio, Texas, a quiet, unassuming life by any measure. That house is built on memories. Every wooden floorboard, every creaking door hinge holds a piece of the life I shared with my late wife, Dorothea. When she passed, she left behind an enormous fortune from the sale of her technology patents. $90 million locked away in a private trust that only I controlled. But I never touched it. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. Before we get into the story, drop a quick comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There's something that feels right about knowing good people are tuned in from all different corners of the world for a story like this one. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been dramatized for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I went on living off my basic pension, driving my weathered Ford F-150, and keeping the wealth locked down tight. I wanted my son Garrett to understand what it meant to earn something. I wanted him to carve out his own path the same way I had carved out mine. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had stood in a tuxedo and watched Garrett marry Renee. The air was already thick with that familiar Texas heat. I was in the living room, quietly working on the gears of an antique mantel clock. The steady ticking of the brass components was the only sound in the house. Reading glasses perched on my nose, hands carrying a faint smear of oil, I was completely absorbed in the simple satisfaction of fixing something broken. Then the silence cracked, the aggressive crunch of tires grinding over gravel. I looked up through the front window. A gleaming white Cadillac Escalade swung into my driveway and rolled to a stop just behind my truck. The engine went quiet, and the doors opened. Out stepped Renee, my brand-new daughter-in-law. She had on a sharp white designer suit, her eyes tucked behind oversized dark sunglasses. She did not carry herself like a woman stopping by to drop off leftover wedding cake. Her posture was rigid, jaw set tight. From the driver's side came a man I had never laid eyes on. Late 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a polished aluminum briefcase. He had the unmistakable predatory bearing of a corporate lawyer. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked out to the porch, the old wooden planks groaning under my boots the way they always did. I put on a warm, open smile, figuring this was some kind of post-wedding errand they needed a hand with. "Ranaichotirao," I called out, raising a hand against the morning glare. "This is a surprise. Where is Garrett?" Renee did not smile back. She did not take off her sunglasses. She came up the stone path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a deliberate gap between us, as though I were something to be avoided. Not a single word of greeting. Instead, she gave a small flick of her hand, motioning for the man beside her to proceed. He stepped up onto my porch. He did not offer a handshake. He simply snapped open his briefcase, drew out a thick manila envelope, and set it down hard on the small patio table beside my rocking chair. The thud of paper hitting wood sounded unnaturally loud in the still morning air. "Mr. Merritt," the man said. His voice was flat, rehearsed, stripped of any trace of human warmth. My name is Conrad Haskell. I am the legal counsel representing the new owners of this property. I am here to formally serve you notice. I frowned, genuinely at a loss. My eyes moved from the envelope to Conrad, then to Renee. New owners. What in the world was he talking about? I had owned this house for 40 years. The mortgage had been paid off 2 decades ago. Conrad straightened his tie and looked at me with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled irritation. Not anymore, sir. This property has been legally transferred and sold. The asset is currently in the process of being liquidated. You have exactly 72 hours to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still occupying this structure by 8 in the morning on Friday, the local sheriff will be summoned to remove you for trespassing on private property. The words just hung there. 72 hours. Vacate. Trespassing. A sharp ringing started up in my ears. For a few seconds, my brain simply would not process the string of sentences this stranger had just delivered to me. I looked over at Renee. She was staring past me, studying a chipped paint spot on the porch railing, wearing the expression of someone bored by an inconvenient errand. Renee, I said, my voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. What is this? Where is my son? She finally brought her eyes to mine. A heavy sigh, like a parent running low on patience with a stubborn child. Garrett is tied up at the office, Walter. He could not be here for this. The house is sold. It is done. Conrad is just doing his job. You need to start packing instead of standing there asking pointless questions. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a sudden and terrifying jolt of adrenaline. I reached down and picked up the manila envelope. I tore it open. Inside was a stack of legal documents. Deeds of trust, transfer of ownership forms, sale agreements. I scanned the dense legal language, searching for some explanation, some foothold of reason in the madness. Then I turned to the last page and my breath snagged. At the bottom sat a red county notary seal. Beside it was a power of attorney declaration, granting full legal authority to liquidate all real estate assets held in my name. And just above the signature line was my name, Walter Merritt, written out in my own hand. A perfect match. The long, sweeping loops of the letters, the sharp angles, the exact weight of the stroke. It was precisely how I signed my checks, my tax returns, my contracts, flawless. Except for one massive, horrifying fact. I had never signed that paper. I stared at the ink on the page. The understanding hit me like something heavy and fast. This was no clerical error. This was no bank mix-up. This was deliberate, calculated, and thoroughly illegal forgery. And there was only one person alive who had ever had access to my old tax returns and filing cabinets, close enough to trace that signature with such precision. My own flesh and blood, my son Garrett. Conrad tapped his expensive watch. I strongly suggest you start calling moving companies Mr. Merritt. The new buyers are eager to begin renovations. I will leave my card on the table. Do not attempt to contact my clients directly regarding this matter. All further communication goes through my office exclusively. He set a glossy white business card down beside the envelope. Renee turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the stone path, and walked back to the Escalade without a backward glance. Conrad followed, taking the driver's seat. The engine roared, and the SUV reversed out of my driveway, throwing up a cloud of white dust before vanishing down the suburban street. I stood alone on my porch. The Texas sun pressed down on my shoulders, but my whole body had gone ice cold. My own son and his wife of 1 week had ambushed me. They had forged a federal document. They had stolen the house I had built with my own hands. They were tossing me out onto the street like a stray animal, confident I was nothing more than a poor, defenseless old pensioner who would have no real choice but to fold. I looked down at the forged signature one more time. A strange, quiet calm began settling over me. The shock was draining away, replaced by the methodical precision of a man who had spent his working life diagnosing complex mechanical failures. They thought I was weak. They thought I was naive. They had absolutely no idea about the $90 million monster they had just woken up. I folded the document, slid it back into the envelope, and went inside. I had a phone call to make. I stepped through the front door and pulled it shut behind me. The heavy oak door closed with that solid, familiar click, cutting off the punishing Texas heat and the thin haze of dust Renee's departing Escalade had left behind. Inside the house was perfectly still, save for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock I had been working on just minutes before. That sound had always steadied me, a mechanical heartbeat anchoring me to this place. But now each tick felt like a hammer stroke counting down. 72 hours. That was what they had given me. 3 short days to erase 40 years of living. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my boots scuffing softly against the hardwood floors that Dorothea and I had laid down with our own hands. I set the manila envelope on the cold granite island. The air conditioning kicked on, pushing a sudden chill across my sweat-damp shirt. I did not panic. I did not hurl things across the room or shout into the silence. That is simply not how my mind operates. Decades of engineering work had conditioned me to meet sudden catastrophe with cold, detached logic. When a bridge gives way or a critical turbine seizes, you do not stand over the wreckage and grieve. You isolate the structural weakness. You locate the exact point of failure. My point of failure, it appeared, had been my blind and unconditional trust in my own son. I pulled out one of the heavy wooden bar stools and sat down. My hands, still carrying faint traces of dark oil from the clock gears, reached for the documents. I drew the papers back out of the envelope and spread them carefully across the smooth stone surface. The transfer of ownership, the quitclaim deed, the aggressive eviction notice. I lined them up with the precise, methodical attention of a man reading a complex blueprint. I leaned in, close eyes fixed hard on the final page of the main legal packet. The power of attorney declaration. It was dated a little over a month ago. I ran a calloused index finger along the signature at the bottom. Walter Merritt. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. Whoever had done this had not dashed off a careless imitation. They had studied my handwriting with a frightening degree of dedication. The slight upward lean of the capital H, the deliberate sharp cross of the T in my last name, the way the dark ink tapered off at the very tail of the double L, all of it accounted for. A casual observer, even a standard bank teller, would have waved it through without a second thought. But I knew my own hand. More than that, I understood the physical mechanics of ink meeting paper. The pressure on the pen was wrong. The signature lacked the fluid, unbroken momentum of a man writing his own name without thinking. It had been drawn, not written. But identifying it as a calculated forgery was only the first step. The more urgent question was how they had managed to engineer the whole scheme. Renee, with her tailored designer suits and that entitled smirk, was certainly shrewd enough to dream it up. The chilling, dismissive look she had worn on the porch replayed clearly in my mind. She had regarded me not as a father-in-law, but as a tiresome, obsolete obstacle standing directly between her and a massive payday. She had stood there coolly inspecting her manicure, while her lawyer handed down what amounted to a swift death sentence on my retirement. But Renee had never had access to my private filing cabinets. Renee did not know where I kept my old tax returns, my property deeds, or my personal identification documents. Only one person had keys to this house. Only one person knew my daily routines, my private habits, my comings and goings. Garrett, my son, the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle in the very driveway he was now attempting to ruthlessly steal. The betrayal was crystallizing in my mind, hardening rapidly into something razor-sharp and dangerous. I thought back to the lawyer Conrad Haskell. He had delivered that threatening card with the cold, efficient manner of a corporate executioner. He had explicitly stated that a moving crew would arrive on Monday at exactly 8 in the morning. Why Monday, I asked myself, staring at the kitchen wall. Why the brutally compressed 72-hour window in the calculated world of commercial real estate and legal evictions? 72 hours is an impossibly narrow margin. It is engineered to trigger immediate panic. It is a psychological pressure tactic designed to overwhelm the target, completely forcing them to scramble frantically for moving boxes instead of retaining a competent defense attorney. They needed me disoriented. They wanted me worn down and humiliated, hauling black trash bags out to the back of my weathered Ford F-150 before the weekend was even finished. They knew full well that given enough time to think clearly, enough room to contest the eviction through proper legal channels, their fraudulent power of attorney would not survive a single moment under the scrutiny of a federal judge. The aggression of their opening move was their only real tactical edge. They were banking entirely on the assumption that a 70-year-old widower apparently subsisting on a modest pension would have neither the financial resources nor the emotional stamina to go up against a well-funded corporate law firm. They had convinced themselves I would simply lower my head, pack my memories into cardboard boxes, and vanish quietly into whatever low-income facility I could scrape together enough money to afford. I leaned back on the wooden bar stool and let out one slow, measured breath. The antique mantel clock in the living room chimed the quarter hour, a rich, resonant sound. I was not going anywhere. The trusting, open-hearted father who had stood proudly in a tuxedo at his son's lavish wedding exactly 7 days ago was gone. He had ceased to exist on that front porch the moment Renee had refused to take off her sunglasses. What remained in his place was a man who quietly held a $90 million fortune and possessed all the patience needed to systematically dismantle their criminal operation piece by careful piece. I gathered the forged documents and slid them back into the thick manila envelope. I rose from the kitchen island feeling a strange and undeniable current of energy moving through me. The first phase of any sound strategic response demanded complete emotional control. I needed to hear my son's voice. I needed to hear precisely how he intended to justify this. I walked over to the old landline mounted on the kitchen wall. I studied the worn plastic buttons for a moment, steadying myself. I lifted the receiver, listened to the hollow dial tone, drew one final breath to bury my anger entirely, and dialed Garrett's number. "Dad," Garrett finally said. His tone was remarkably composed. No surprise, no hesitation. He sounded exactly like a man waiting for a scripted cue. "Garrett," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough to suggest a man coming apart. "What is happening? Renee was just here. She brought a lawyer. They handed me papers telling me I have to leave my own home in 3 days. Please tell me there is some terrible misunderstanding." I waited for the crack. Instead, I got a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Dad, please calm down," Garrett said softly. "I know this is a shock. I wanted to tell you in person, but I was afraid of how you would react. I could not stand the thought of watching you get upset. But we had to do this. We had no other choice. No other choice," I repeated, pressing my weight against the granite countertop to sell the impression of a broken man, even though he could not see me. "This is my home. You forged my signature, Garrett. You sold my house." "Dad, stop," he cut in gently. "Do not say things like that. No one forged anything. You signed those papers last month. You just do not remember doing it." The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. "I do not remember." I let my voice fracture perfectly. "What are you talking about?" "It is okay, Dad," Garrett replied, his tone dropping into the patronizing register one reserves for a frightened child. "We have talked about this. The doctor warned Renee and me that your dementia is advancing rapidly. You are having serious memory lapses. You are becoming a danger to yourself." "Dementia," I repeated, genuinely stunned by the reach of his fabrication. "I have never received a dementia diagnosis in my life. The last time I saw Dr. Harris, it was nothing more than a routine cholesterol check." "Dad, you are in denial," Garrett continued smoothly. "Do you not recall the gas stove incident last week? You left the burner running on high. You nearly burned the house down. If Renee and I had not come by to check on you, you could have died. We cannot allow you to go on living alone. It simply is not safe." I closed my eyes. The gas stove incident. The memory came back with absolute clarity. Garrett had come over to make a pot of soup. He had specifically sent me out to the garage to track down an old socket wrench. While I was out there, he must have deliberately cranked the burner up, letting the broth boil over into the open flame. He had manufactured a fire hazard to build a false medical narrative around me. He had been laying the groundwork for this betrayal right in front of my face. I could still remember wiping the greasy soot from the ceramic stovetop after they rushed out the door. "When I did not leave the stove on Garrett," I said quietly, threading just enough desperation into my voice. "You were making the soup. You sent me to the garage. And that is exactly what the doctor warned us about." Garrett said, his voice thick with counterfeit grief. "You are inventing memories to fill in the gaps. You are mixing up the details. Dad, it breaks my heart to hear you this way. It truly does. But it only confirms that Renee and I made the right call. We sold the house to secure you a place in a premier assisted living facility. We used the equity to cover a full care package. You will have round-the-clock medical supervision, hot meals, and a safe environment. We did this to save your life." A premier assisted living facility. The words were smooth, responsible sounding, and entirely hollow. I knew precisely what my house was worth, and I knew exactly what those facilities ran. The numbers did not work. If they had genuinely secured a placement for me, they would have walked me through the process. They would not have dispatched a corporate lawyer armed with a 72-hour eviction notice and a threat about the local sheriff. "Garrett, please," I said, forcing a sob into my voice. "You cannot drive me out of my own home. I built this house with your mother. Her garden is out there. Her memory lives in every room. You cannot just pack me off like some worn-out piece of furniture." I waited through the heavy silence, wondering whether invoking his mother would find any crack in his armor. Dorothea had adored Garrett. She had spoiled him, shielded him, and believed to her last breath that he would grow into a man of genuine character. For a brief moment, the line went completely still. "Dad, Mom is gone," Garrett finally said. All warmth had drained from his voice now. The sympathy was gone, replaced by something cold and flat and entirely practical. "And if she were here, she would want you to be safe. She would be on our side. You are no longer capable of making decisions for yourself. You are sick. You need to accept that." The cruelty of invoking his dead mother to justify his crime was the final confirmation I required. My son was gone. The boy I had raised had been replaced entirely by a cold, calculating stranger willing to throw me away for a quick windfall. "The movers will be there Monday morning at 8 sharp." Garrett continued, stepping fully into the role of the man in charge. "Have your clothes and personal items packed and ready. Do not attempt to take any of the large furniture or appliances. Those were included in the property sale. Renee will come by with a rental car to drive you to the new facility. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, Dad. We are doing this out of love. We want what is best for you. I drew one slow, steady breath. I gripped the receiver tightly, the hard plastic pressing into my palm. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to expose his lies right then, to tell him I knew about the forgery, to promise him destruction. But I needed more time. I needed to execute my response without a single misstep. "Okay, Garrett," I whispered, making myself sound completely hollowed out. "Okay, I will pack my things. I am just so confused. I am so tired." "I know, Dad," he replied, smooth as oil. "Just rest. We will take care of everything." He hung up. I set the receiver quietly back onto the wall hook. The faint plastic click carried through the empty hallway. The full weight of their betrayal settled over me like something suffocating. They had already stolen my past, and they were convinced they had mapped out my entire future as well. They were catastrophically wrong. I crossed to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my face. I dried my hands on a cotton towel and stared at my own reflection in the window pane above the faucet. Old, yes, but nowhere near finished. The real fight had only just begun. I stood at that sink, cold water still dripping from my chin, the physical sensation pulling me back into the present moment. The brazenness of Garrett's words was still ringing through the quiet room. Dementia. He had planted that seed with such casual, calibrated precision. I dried my face with the cotton towel, letting the rough texture drag me back from the edge of blind fury. In my years as a mechanical engineer, I had built a career around diagnosing catastrophic system failures. When a structure collapses, you do not stand over the debris and rage at the broken metal. You trace the fault lines back to their point of origin. You look for the hairline fractures that began forming long before the whole thing gave way. My own son was not simply lying to cover a spontaneous theft. He was executing a carefully constructed long-range strategy. He had been quietly building the narrative of my supposed mental deterioration for weeks, grooming the medical story so thoroughly that when the final blow landed, no one would think to question his motives. The anger in my chest began to shift, hardening from heat into something cold and sharp. I pushed back from the sink and lowered myself onto the heavy wooden bar stool. I needed to take his alibi apart piece by piece. I needed to examine the load-bearing structure of his fabrications. And the central pillar holding up his entire construction was that incident with the gas stove. I closed my eyes and ran the memory back frame by frame, paying close attention to every detail I had let pass by without examination. It had happened exactly 10 days ago. Garrett had appeared at my door completely unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, cheerfully carrying 2 bags of premium organic groceries and announcing he wanted to cook his old man a proper batch of homemade vegetable soup. At the time, it had felt like a rare and genuinely moving gesture. I had sat at this very kitchen island watching him chop carrots and celery, feeling that familiar swell of fatherly pride. He filled the heavy cast-iron pot, set it on the front left burner, and touched a match to the bright orange flame. Then came the pivot. The exact moment the stress fracture opened. Garrett turned to me, calm, unhurt, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, and asked a very specific question. Did I still have that set of metric socket wrenches out in the garage? He said he needed to borrow them to tighten a rattling bracket on Renee's car. He knew precisely where they lived, at the very bottom of my heavy steel toolbox, buried in the farthest, most cluttered corner of the detached garage. Retrieving them would take at least 10 or 15 minutes of digging. I had smiled, genuinely glad to be useful, and walked out the back door without a shadow of suspicion. The moment my boot hit the concrete outside, the trap was already sprung. While I was laboring in the stifling heat of the garage, shifting heavy metal trays and searching by feel for the right sockets, Garrett was not waiting patiently in the kitchen. He had cranked the burner to its absolute maximum. He had made sure the soup would boil over fast enough to extinguish the flame, while leaving the gas running freely into the enclosed space. Then he walked out the front door. No goodbye. He did not wait around for the wrenches he claimed to need. He simply left, abandoning his own father, to walk back inside to a kitchen steadily filling with combustible gas. I remember coughing, hard eyes streaming as the smoke alarm split the air with its shriek. I lunged for the stove, flapping a dish towel at the gray haze and wrenching the knob to cut the gas. Not 5 minutes later, Garrett and Renee had burst through the front door, gasping and wild-eyed, insisting they had turned around halfway down the street, realized they had not said a proper goodbye, and spotted smoke coming from the kitchen window just in time. They had grabbed my shoulders, shaking, and wide-eyed themselves, performing terror so convincingly it had worked. Garrett had looked me straight in the eye and asked with heartbreaking sincerity why I had turned the burner up so high and then wandered away. I had been so disoriented by the smoke and the alarms that I had genuinely doubted my own recollection. I had apologized to them, sincerely, fully believing I had committed a frightening, age-related lapse in judgment. Now, sitting alone in the silence of my kitchen, the truth hit me like a structural collapse, sudden, total, and irreversible. It was not a memory failure. It was a staged crime scene. Garrett had deliberately engineered a potentially lethal fire hazard to manufacture a documented episode of cognitive decline. He was building a fraudulent medical record, a paper trail of incompetence to legally underpin his forged power of attorney. He had put my life at genuine risk, simply to steal my home. The realization was so dark, so deeply calculated, that it burned away every last trace of paternal feeling remaining in me. My son was operating with the cold efficiency of a corporate predator. If I stormed over to his house right now, arms flailing and shouting about forgeries and staged fires, I would be walking straight into the narrative he had built for me. I would look exactly like a paranoid, deeply confused old man in the grip of advanced dementia. The authorities would glance at his perfectly executed legal paperwork, hear his practiced, sympathetic account of the kitchen fire, and gently usher me toward the psychiatric ward. Meeting them with honest, righteous fury was a guaranteed road to total defeat. Brute force was not the weapon for this fight. Deception was. I stayed on the bar stool, staring into the empty air, and let my new reality settle around me. I had gone undercover inside my own life. They wanted a compliant, helpless victim, and I was going to deliver a performance worthy of an award. My son believed he was the architect of my destruction, without any awareness that in doing so, he had handed me the exact blueprints to his own. I pushed up from the kitchen island and moved down the hallway toward my private study. The heavy silence of the house pressed in from all sides, but my mind was operating with a clean, singular focus. I needed my tools. A mechanical engineer never relies on the naked eye alone when he is tracing a catastrophic failure. He relies on precision instruments. I pulled open the top drawer of my heavy oak desk and retrieved my silver-framed reading glasses, settling them onto my nose. Right beside them sat my jeweler loupe, a compact, steel-bodied instrument I had relied on for decades to spot hairline fractures in aircraft-grade titanium. I picked it up, felt its familiar weight in my palm, and walked back to the kitchen. I drew the thick manila envelope back toward me and eased out the stack of legal documents. I set the eviction notice and the transfer of ownership deed to one side, isolating the single most critical sheet in the entire packet. The power of attorney declaration. I pressed it flat against the cool granite surface. I leaned in close, fitting the loop over my right eye, and brought my face within a few inches of the page. The signature itself I had already confirmed as a masterful forgery, a near-perfect rendering of my own hand. But a signature alone does not make a legal document enforceable. It needs a witness. It needs a state seal. I shifted my focus away from the forged ink and tracked down to the bottom left corner of the page. There, stamped firmly into the paper was the official circular seal of a Texas notary public. I angled the overhead kitchen light to catch the faint embossed ridges in the blue ink and read the fine print inside the seal. The notary's name was one I had never encountered, almost certainly a corrupt associate, Conrad Haskell, kept on hand for exactly this sort of work. But the name was not what stopped my breath. It was the date block printed just below the seal. The text stated clearly that I, Walter Merritt, had personally appeared before this notary in San Antonio, Texas. The date typed on the official line was August 14th. I held the loop steady, letting those numbers burn into my memory. August 14th. I drew the instrument slowly away from my eye and set it on the counter. A cold, tight smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. My son was a sharp man, business degree, high-level corporate accounts, a well-developed instinct for strategy. He had planned this fraudulent takeover with genuine care, staging a kitchen fire to establish a medical record, retaining a ruthless attorney to execute the eviction. But in his rush and his arrogance, he had made one fatal, sloppy administrative error. He had chosen the wrong date. I left the kitchen and returned to my study, bypassing the filing cabinets and going straight to the tall wooden bookshelf in the corner. I reached for a battered canvas-bound notebook on the middle shelf. My personal fishing log. Since Dorothea passed, I had made a point of taking one major fully off-grid fishing trip every year, recording every catch, every weather condition, every location with the meticulous precision of an engineer. I carried it back to the kitchen and set it down on the island beside the forged document. I turned through the thick pages, the scent of old paper and dried sea salt lifting into the air. I moved past the spring and early summer entries, my fingers tracing the margins until I arrived at the middle of August. There it was, in my own unmistakable hand, supported by detailed sketches and precise coordinate notations. On August 14th, I was not in San Antonio, Texas. I was not within range of any law office or notary public. On the exact day this document claimed I had personally signed away the rights to my home, I was more than 3,000 miles away. I was standing on the rain-slicked deck of a commercial deep-sea fishing charter off the rugged coast of Sitka, Alaska. The memories came back with total clarity. The biting wind cutting across the bow, the great gray swells hammering the hull. I remembered the sharp smell of diesel and fresh bait. I remembered wrestling with a 55 lb king salmon for nearly 40 minutes. But what mattered most was the isolation. We were running in open water well beyond the reach of any cellular tower or communications network. I had not sent a single email, placed a call, or received a text message for 5 consecutive days. I looked from the open pages of the fishing log to the fraudulent legal document. The contrast was beautiful. My son had constructed what he believed was an inescapable trap, but he had inadvertently handed me an airtight, indisputable alibi. I had the plane ticket receipts. I had the official passenger manifest from the charter company. I had credit card charges at the marina for rented fishing gear, and I had 15 other men on that vessel, the captain and his crew among them, each of whom could testify under oath that I was stranded in the middle of the Alaskan Ocean. On the very day I supposedly walked into a San Antonio office to execute that document. The power of attorney was not merely questionable. It was provably, criminally fraudulent. The entire legal foundation of their scheme rested on a demonstrable lie. I closed the notebook, my mind moving quickly through the implications. When you locate one critical structural flaw in what appears to be a sound building, you must assume the entire foundation is compromised. Garrett had committed a serious federal crime to steal this house, crossing a threshold most people never come near. If he was willing to risk federal prison time over a property deed, what else had he reached into? What other systems had he been quietly compromising while I was not paying attention? The thought spread through me like a dark stain. The house was a physical asset. It could be transferred, contested, recovered. But my life touched dozens of other vulnerable points. If Garrett had managed to bypass the legal safeguards protecting a property deed, he could just as easily move against the security protocols on my everyday finances. He knew my social security number. He knew my mother's maiden name. He had every answer to every security question on every account. I pushed the documents aside. The window for examining the past had closed. I needed to check my bank accounts, and I needed to do it now. I left the study and walked down the short hallway to the small spare room I used as a home office. It was an unassuming space, old drafting tables, rolled-up blueprints, and a solid, unremarkable desktop computer in the corner. I sat down in my worn leather desk chair and pressed the power button. The machine came to life, the cooling fan whirring softly in the quiet house. While the outdated operating system worked its way through the startup sequence, I turned over the financial boundaries I had deliberately established with my son across the past decade. When Dorothea passed and left me the Merit Trust, I had made a conscious, firm decision to keep my daily life entirely separate from that enormous fortune. I wanted to remain the man I had always been. I wanted to buy my own groceries, mow my own lawn, and live within the honest means of a retired mechanical engineer. To preserve that careful separation, I had kept my original local bank account fully active. It was a standard public checking account, holding exactly $40,000. That balance represented the accumulated total of my modest company pension and some conservative low-yield savings. This was the only financial account Garrett knew existed. Whenever he stopped by, if his eyes happened to drift toward a bank statement left out on the kitchen counter, what he'd see was a comfortable but decidedly working-class balance. He was convinced that $40,000 plus whatever equity remained in the house made up the absolute entirety of my net worth on this earth. The computer screen finally came to life, throwing a pale bluish glow across my face. I opened the browser and pulled up the familiar login page for my local Texas bank. My fingers moved across the keyboard on autopilot, entering my username and the long, complex password I'd long since committed to muscle memory. I hit submit. The page loaded with agonizing slowness, that tiny, spinning circle feeling like something pressing down hard against my chest. I drew a steadying breath, bracing myself for whatever fresh violation I was about to find. The account dashboard appeared on the monitor. My eyes went straight to the bold black figures displayed at the very top of the screen beneath the heading Available Balance. I leaned in closer, the harsh screen light catching the lenses of my silver reading glasses. I blinked, telling myself the bank's website had to be glitching somehow. I refreshed the page. The screen flickered, reloaded, and returned the exact same devastating figure. 0. The account had been wiped clean. Every last cent I had earned across 40 years of honest grinding work on the manufacturing floor gone. I felt no panic about the lost money. The funds themselves meant absolutely nothing to me. I had $90 million sitting securely in a private, heavily encrypted trust fund managed by top-tier financial professionals. I could hemorrhage $40,000 every day for the remainder of my life and never register the blow. But the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the theft that made my blood run cold. My son had not simply forged a legal deed to strip the roof from over my head. He had reached deliberately into my pocket and taken the very last dollar attached to my name. I moved the cursor and clicked on the detailed transaction history tab. I needed to see the exact mechanism of the theft, precisely how and when the extraction had been carried out. The digital ledger filled the screen, months of ordinary, unremarkable expenses, laid out in rows, a grocery bill here, a utility payment there, and then, sitting at the very top of the list, a massive and glaring anomaly. An outgoing domestic wire transfer had been initiated and fully processed just the previous afternoon. The withdrawal amount was exactly $39,985, leaving a negligible $15 fee balance the bank had promptly absorbed. I clicked the specific transaction to pull up the routing details. The money had been wired directly to a commercial holding account located in Detroit, Michigan. I fixed my gaze on the small typed text in the optional memo field attached to the wire. The words had been chosen with a sickening, calculated precision. Medical facility deposit. My hands curled into tight fists, fingernails pressing hard into my palms. Garrett and Renee had actually used my own stolen pension money to bankroll their fabricated narrative. They were moving my cash to make it appear as though they were responsibly securing my placement in a premier assisted living center. It was a masterful, deeply cynical piece of accounting. Should any local investigator or sharp-eyed bank manager ever review the paper trail, what they'd find was a devoted son responsibly transferring his deteriorating father's assets to cover urgent and necessary medical care. They had robbed me completely blind and dressed the robbery up as an act of profound filial devotion. I pushed my chair back from the desk, letting it roll smoothly across the plastic floor mat. I steepled my fingers beneath my chin and stared into the dark corners of the room. The initial wave of raw paternal heartbreak was entirely behind me now. My engineering mind engaged, reducing the situation to cold, stripped-down data points. Something about this elaborate crime failed basic logical scrutiny. I ran through the variables. Garrett was a senior vice president at a prominent logistics firm. He pulled a highly respectable six-figure salary padded further by quarterly corporate bonuses and a generous benefits package. Renee had always made a point of broadcasting her affluent upbringing in Charlotte forever, showing off expensive designer handbags and a supposedly vast investment portfolio. They occupied an exclusive high-rent address in the city. They drove imported luxury vehicles. Every surface of their lives projected an image of untouchable financial success. So why in the world would two supposedly wealthy, successful professionals expose themselves to serious federal wire fraud charges to steal a paltry $40,000 from an old man? If naked greed were the motive, they would have simply taken the house. The house was worth close to $500,000 in the current market, a massive, lucrative asset that justified the considerable legal risk of a forged notary seal. But draining a basic checking account for a fraction of that figure, that was not the behavior of calculated corporate greed. That was the behavior of pure, unfiltered desperation. People sitting on millions of dollars do not risk 15 years in a federal penitentiary to steal 40 grand. You only take that kind of absolute terrifying gamble when your back is completely against the wall. You only commit that level of sloppy, traceable fraud when you are frantic for immediate liquid cash. That realization settled over me with a slow, heavy, ominous weight. Garrett and Renee were not wealthy. They were completely devastatingly broke. The entire lavish lifestyle was a hollow, crumbling facade. They were drowning beneath some kind of massive, suffocating debt, and the pressure had finally broken them. The rushed house sale, the forged documents, the stolen pension money, the aggressive eviction notice. None of it was about upgrading a luxury lifestyle or building towards some brighter future. It was a panicked, desperate scramble just to stay afloat. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately, which meant something or someone had them genuinely terrified. I needed to identify exactly what kind of monster was running my son down, because that very same monster was the instrument I intended to use to destroy him. I pushed back from the computer desk and walked out of the small office, my steps deliberate and measured. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and continued down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2 in the morning, the perfect hour for the kind of work I was about to set in motion. I crossed to the heavy oak armoire that had belonged to my grandfather. I took a firm grip on its lower edge and pushed it to the right. The heavy piece slid smoothly across the hardwood floor on hidden custom-installed casters, uncovering a plain section of wooden floorboards beneath. I knelt and pressed my thumb against a specific, barely visible knot in the wood. A small rectangular panel popped free, revealing the biometric scanner of my hidden floor safe. I pressed my right index finger firmly against the illuminated glass plate. The heavy steel locking mechanism disengaged with a deep, satisfying metallic thud. I raised the door. Inside rested several stacks of physical currency, some old heirloom jewelry I had kept from Dorothea, and a small, heavy black case. I reached past the cash and pulled out the case, unsnapping the latches to expose a sleek, satellite-encrypted phone, a piece of hardware ordinarily reserved for high-level corporate executives operating in hostile foreign territories. I had acquired it specifically for managing the Merit Trust, ensuring that none of my substantial financial transactions ever intersected with my exposed public local networks. I carried the encrypted phone back to the living room and settled into my favorite leather recliner. I powered the device on, watching the small screen flood the dark room with a hard white light. I bypassed the standard dialing menu and keyed in a complex sequence of numbers entirely from memory. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice came on. "Mr. Merritt," the voice said. It was Claudette Pereira. Claudette was the senior wealth manager of the Merit Trust, a brilliant, absolutely ruthless financial strategist who oversaw my $90 million portfolio with an iron grip. She was one of a very small number of people on this earth who understood the true scale of my resources. "It is quite late in Texas," she continued. "I trust this is not a social call." "Claudette," I replied, letting my voice settle into its natural, authoritative register. The frail, confused old man who had spoken to Garrett just an hour earlier was gone without a trace. "I need you to initiate a total scorched earth financial audit, and I need it done right now." I heard a subtle shift in her breathing on the line. The pleasantries evaporated instantly. "Give me the targets," she said. "Garrett Merritt and Renee Merritt." I instructed, a cold, dark satisfaction spreading through me as I formally placed my own son in the crosshairs. "I want your elite forensic accounting team deployed immediately. Dig into every dimension of their financial lives. I want every credit card statement, every wire transfer, every mortgage document, and every tax return from the last 5 years. I need to know exactly who they owe money to, how much, and what collateral is on the line. They are absolutely desperate for cash, Claudette. They just committed a massive federal wire fraud to steal $40,000 from my public pension account. And they used a forged power of attorney to illegally sell my primary residence." A moment of stunned silence held on the other end of the encrypted connection. "Your son forged a property deed to steal your home," Claudette asked, her voice carrying genuine professional outrage. "Walter, that is a severe federal offense. My legal team can have an injunction filed by dawn to freeze the sale. I can have local authorities at his front door before he finishes his morning coffee." "No," I cut in sharply. "Leave the property sale untouched. Do not alert the authorities. If you block it now, they will panic and scatter, and I will never learn who is pulling their strings. I want them convinced they have won. I want them feeling completely, utterly secure in their success. Do not freeze any accounts, and do not trigger any automated banking alerts. This audit must remain strictly covert. They cannot know that anyone is examining their books. I need the raw data, Claudette. I need to understand the precise anatomy of their desperation. Understood, she replied smoothly, recalibrating immediately to my strategic parameters. My team will operate under ghost protocols. We will trace their digital footprint without leaving any prints of our own. What is our operational timeline? You have exactly 24 hours, I said, my gaze drifting across the room to the face of the antique mantel clock. They handed me a 72-hour eviction notice, which means they are working against a brutally compressed deadline. The moving trucks arrive Monday morning. I need the complete financial dossier by tomorrow night. I need to know exactly what kind of monster is chasing them, because I fully intend to feed them straight to it. I will have the preliminary data package delivered to your encrypted server by tomorrow evening, Claudette confirmed. Is there anything else, Walter? Physical security, a secure relocation team? No, I replied, my voice even. I am perfectly safe, just get me the data. I ended the call and set the heavy satellite phone down on the glass coffee table. I leaned back into the leather upholstery and drew a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady drum of adrenaline moving through my veins. The trap was officially set. The financial bloodhounds were off their leashes, silently tracking my son's every digital movement. But while Claudette and her team waged a quiet, invisible campaign in the digital realm, I still had a physical performance to sustain in the real world. My eyes moved to the large bay window at the front of the living room. The curtains were drawn, but I understood the reality of a tight-knit suburban neighborhood. People talk. Neighbors watch. If Garrett had sent anyone to cruise past and verify my compliance, or if a curious neighbor was simply peering through their blinds, I needed to look precisely like a defeated and cooperative victim. I pushed up from the recliner and walked out to the attached garage. Near the lawnmower sat a stack of flattened, heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes. I grabbed half a dozen of them, along with a roll of clear packing tape, and hauled them back inside. I dropped the supplies on the living room floor. The harsh, ripping shriek of the packing tape cut through the quiet as I assembled the first box. I folded the bottom flaps, taped them down firmly, and positioned the empty box near the front window, deliberately placed where it would read clearly from the street. I was laying the groundwork for a devastating war, one meticulous detail at a time. Garrett was about to discover the true cost of what he had done. I sealed the final box and shoved it against the wall, completing the visual illusion for any eyes that might be trained on the front of the house. It was time to move into the next phase of the operation. To dismantle their scheme from the inside, I needed a direct line into their private world. I walked to the bedroom and slid open my nightstand drawer. Tucked beneath a pile of old reading glasses lay 2 miniature digital voice recorders. I had bought them years ago to quietly dictate engineering notes while working in cramped industrial spaces. They were remarkably compact, highly sensitive, and capable of recording continuously for 72 hours. I slipped both devices into my left jacket pocket. Then I went to the hall closet and lifted down a small, heavy wooden chest that held Dorothea's most treasured antique photo albums. I wiped the dust from the lid and carried it to the kitchen counter. I picked up my phone and dialed Renee's number. I cleared my throat deliberately, constricting my vocal cords, threading a rough, wet tremor through my voice. She answered on the 4th ring. Her tone was clipped and impatient. I drew a shallow, unsteady breath and spoke. "Renee," I said, letting my voice fracture pitifully. "It is Walter. I am so sorry to bother you." A heavy sigh came through the line. "What is it, Walter?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "We are very busy managing your transition." "I know," I whispered, sounding wrung out and beaten. "I am packing my things just like Garrett asked, but I came across Dorothea's old photo albums. The facility only permits 2 small suitcases. I cannot bring myself to throw her memories in the trash. Could I drop the box off at your place just to keep them safe? I promise I will not stay long." I could almost hear the calculation running behind her silence. She wanted me gone from her life entirely, but refusing a weeping old man his dead wife's photographs was a bad look even for her. Beyond that, letting me bring them over fit neatly into her own narrative of victory. She was the gracious caretaker indulging her father-in-law's final pitiful requests. "Fine," she snapped, "but make it quick. Garrett is not here, and I have a dozen calls to get through." I poured on the gratitude, laying it thick, and ended the call. I lugged the heavy wooden chest out to my weathered Ford F-150 and drove across town to their upscale neighborhood. They occupied a sprawling modern penthouse in one of the city's most expensive high-rise buildings. As I swung into the gleaming circular driveway and handed my keys to the uniformed valet, my mind turned to the stolen $40,000. Every inch of this extravagant lifestyle was a hollow illusion propped up by theft and deception. I rode the private elevator to the top floor, my pulse steady, my hands perfectly still. I stepped into the private foyer and knocked softly on their massive double doors. Renee pulled the door open, wearing a silk designer robe, a sleek tablet pressed tight in her manicured hand. She looked me over slowly, her eyes contracting with undisguised contempt. She was not looking at a retired engineer. She was looking at a worn-out, obsolete burden. "Come in," she ordered, stepping back without any offer to help with the heavy chest. "Just put it somewhere out of the way, and do not scuff the hardwood." I shuffled forward, deliberately rounding my shoulders and shortening my gait to mimic a frail and disoriented old man. I clutched the heavy wooden chest awkwardly against my ribs, letting my hands shake just enough to sell it. Crossing the vast, sun-drenched living room, I intentionally caught the edge of an expensive Persian rug with my left boot. I lurched forward with a sharp gasp and let the box drop from my grip. It hit the floor with a loud crash. Several thick photo albums tumbled out and skidded across the polished wood. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Renee hissed, her eyes rolling toward the ceiling in pure exasperation. "Walter, watch what you were doing." "I am so sorry, Renee," I stammered, going to my knees with practiced, pitiful clumsiness. "My hands just are not cooperating today. I am so turned around by all of this." I began slowly, shakily collecting the scattered albums from the floor. Renee stood directly over me and made no move whatsoever to help. Her face was a portrait of undiluted contempt. She opened her mouth to continue the scolding, but her tablet suddenly erupted with a loud ring. She glanced at the screen, and something shifted behind her eyes. It was clearly a call she had been on edge waiting for. "Just clean up this mess and leave the box in the corner," she snapped, already turning her back on me without a second glance. "I have to take this. Do not touch anything else." She moved quickly away, pacing in tight lines toward the far end of the open-concept kitchen, voice already climbing to greet whoever was waiting on the line. This was my exact window of opportunity. The instant her back was fully turned, the frail and trembling old man vanished without a trace. What I was about to uncover in the hours ahead would rewrite everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. And once I knew the full truth, there was no going back. Let me ask you this: if you suspected someone you loved was quietly working against you, would you confront them directly, or would you gather every piece of proof first and say nothing? I moved with the swift, silent efficiency of a seasoned mechanic. I reached into my left jacket pocket and drew out the first miniature digital voice recorder. I slid quietly across the floor toward their massive, custom-designed sectional sofa. Reaching underneath the heavy fabric, I felt along the frame for a solid wooden crossbeam. I pressed the adhesive backing of the small device firmly against the concealed wood, fixing it securely near the center of the room. It would capture every conversation that took place in that living space. I quietly gathered the remaining photo albums, arranged them back in the wooden chest, and pushed the box snugly against the wall. Renee was still moving through the kitchen, her back to me, arguing in a low, heated voice about a delayed wire transfer. I straightened up and walked quietly down the wide hallway toward the master suite. I knew this penthouse's layout well. Garrett kept a private, soundproofed home office just off the main bedroom. If either of them was discussing their debts or orchestrating further criminal activity, those conversations would happen behind those closed doors. I slipped silently into the office. The room was immaculate, a vast glass desk anchoring the space flanked by 3 computer monitors. I had no interest in rifling through his drawers. What I needed was a listening post that would never be stumbled upon casually. I stepped into the small private bathroom connected directly to the office. I pulled the second digital voice recorder from my pocket and reached around behind the porcelain toilet tank. I pressed the adhesive strip firmly against the cool, hidden ceramic surface well out of any direct line of sight. I eased back down the wide hallway and timed my return to the living room perfectly. As Renee finished her call, I dropped my shoulders and resumed the hunched, beaten posture near the door. The Trojan horse was inside their walls. I allowed myself a small private smile. My covert operation had officially commenced. I walked out of the opulent penthouse building, handed the valet my ticket, and held the slow, unsteady gait of a broken man until I was sealed inside the cab of my weathered Ford F-150. The moment the heavy door shut and closed out the world, the stooped posture dissolved completely. I sat up straight, gripping the leather steering wheel with firm, steady hands. The drive back across town was a blur of passing streetlights and sliding shadows. I pulled into my driveway and stepped through the front door of my quiet, empty house. The antique mantel clock chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tone a perfect match for the cold, measured rhythm of my thoughts. I moved past the staged cardboard moving boxes in the living room and walked directly to my private study. I settled into the leather chair with the overhead lights off. The only light in the room came from the small brass desk lamp. I unlocked the hidden floor safe, retrieved the heavy black case, and lifted out the satellite-encrypted phone. I set it squarely in the center of the wooden desk and sat in the silent dark waiting. At exactly 2 a.m, the device vibrated with a single sharp tone. The screen blazed white, showing an incoming encrypted data package from Claudette Pereira. I entered my complex alphanumeric decryption key and watched the progress bar sweep rapidly across the screen. Claudette and her elite forensic accounting team had executed my directive without mercy. They had worked with surgical precision, peeling back the glossy, sophisticated veneer of his entire life to lay bare the rotting foundation beneath. I linked the satellite phone to my secure desktop computer and opened the massive digital dossier. The files populated instantly across the large monitor. I worked through the organized folders, opening bank statements, intercepted credit reports, concealed mortgage documents, and layered tax returns. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial demolition. The spreadsheet cells bled a vivid, aggressive red across the screen. I leaned forward, elbows pressing into the desk, absorbing the sheer scale of their complete financial destruction. I had expected to find a handful of overdrawn credit cards, or perhaps an underwater secondary mortgage. What Claudette had unearthed was a financial crater so enormous it defied basic logic. I opened a subfolder dedicated specifically to Renee Merritt. For years, she had paraded through family gatherings, loudly boasting about her prestigious career as an independent corporate strategy consultant. She had projected without effort the image of a highly sought-after executive flying first class to private meetings, dining with venture capitalists. The reality laid out plainly in the forensic audit was shockingly pathetic. Renee was no consultant. Her business registration was nothing more than a hollow shell company, an empty corporate entity used solely to conceal her actual daily activities. She was a day trader, and a spectacularly reckless, wildly incompetent one. She had spent the last 4 years sitting in that luxurious penthouse gambling enormous sums of borrowed money on highly volatile, over-leveraged commercial real estate positions. It had started modestly with Garrett's corporate bonuses covering the early losses, but the aggressive trading had spiraled swiftly into a catastrophic addiction. She had completely stripped their joint savings accounts. She had quietly liquidated their retirement portfolios. She had taken out aggressive secondary loans against their imported luxury vehicles. But the single most devastating document was a consolidated balance sheet Claudette had compiled at the very bottom of the file. Renee's wildly speculative real estate plays had utterly collapsed during a recent market correction. She was currently carrying a negative balance of exactly $2.5 million. $2.5 million. The number held steady on the glowing monitor, a monument to pure, unadulterated arrogance. The stolen $40,000 from my pension account was nothing but a desperate drop in a vast, bottomless bucket. Barely enough liquid cash to pay a fraudulent corporate lawyer and temporarily quiet a collections agent. But the true horror of their situation was not the staggering size of the debt. It was the specific identity of the primary creditor. I clicked on a heavily encrypted file labeled Priority Threat Assessment. The team had meticulously traced the tangled origin of the massive high-interest loans Renee had secured to cover her initial margin calls. She had not borrowed this money from any reputable national bank. Traditional financial institutions carry strict regulatory limits and demand proper collateral. Renee had bypassed the legitimate banking sector entirely. She had foolishly taken out a massive unsecured loan from a shadowy, deeply dangerous private lending syndicate operating out of an industrial district in Detroit. These were not men who mailed polite printed collection notices. They were ruthless, unregulated underground operators who charged predatory astronomical interest rates and applied extreme, violent intimidation to guarantee absolute compliance. I read through the intercepted communication logs Claudette's team had managed to pull from Garrett's private email server. The messages from the Detroit syndicate were chillingly terse and stripped of any standard corporate courtesy. The final message delivered just 4 days ago was a rigid, non-negotiable ultimatum. They had given Garrett and Renee exactly 10 days to produce the initial sum of $1 million. If they failed to meet that deadline, the syndicate explicitly promised severe and unavoidable physical consequences. The implication was clear. Garrett stood to lose considerably more than his corporate title or his luxury penthouse. The terrifying reality of their predicament snapped into focus with perfect cold clarity. The sudden aggressive 72-hour eviction notice, the meticulously forged property deed, the $40,000 stolen from my pension fund. None of it was simple greed. It was a panicked, frantic scramble for bare survival. Garrett had understood he was 10 days from having his legs broken by Detroit enforcers, and his immediate instinct had been to ruthlessly sacrifice his own father to buy himself time. He planned to rapidly liquidate my house, strip the equity, and use my life savings to literally purchase his own survival. I leaned back into the heavy leather chair and felt a cold, dark wave of absolute power move through me. They were bleeding out, terrified of a predator they could not control, completely unaware that they were dealing with a man holding a hidden $90 million fortune. I had the financial resources to either instantly solve their problem or ensure their total and absolute destruction. I sat in the darkened study, the monitor casting its pale light across my face, perfectly content to let the invisible, tightening noose slowly squeeze the last of the air from their arrogant, hollow existence. The digital files illuminated the grim, undeniable shape of their private nightmare. Tomorrow, I would listen to the secret recordings from inside their apartment. I would hear their panic traveling through the hidden microphones in real time. They had foolishly invited the very architect of their complete ruin into their home, cementing their own downfall and sealing their fate without ever realizing it. I woke the following morning, well before the sun had cleared the horizon. The antique mantel clock in the hallway was just striking 5 when I poured my first cup of black coffee and carried it down the narrow hall to the study. The house was utterly still, wrapped in the dense quiet of early dawn. But my mind was already moving with the cold, calculated precision of an engineer preparing for a critical stress test. I settled into my desk chair and opened the heavy black case housing the receiver for the miniature digital voice recorders I had planted inside their penthouse the day before. I plugged a pair of high-quality noise-canceling headphones into the audio jack and fitted them over my ears, adjusting the padded cups until the ambient sounds of the house around me faded into absolute silence. I reached out and turned the small frequency dial on the receiver locking the signal onto the specific channel assigned to the recorder concealed behind the toilet tank in Garrett's home office. At first, there was nothing but the faint rhythmic whisper of static, a hollow white noise that filled my ears completely. I shut my eyes and bore down on the audio feed, waiting with the infinite patience of a predator settled deep in the tall grass. A few minutes passed. Then the static was split open by the sharp, heavy crack of a door slamming. I pressed forward in the leather chair and pushed the headphones harder against my skull. The audio was remarkably clean, pulling in the distinct, frantic percussion of leather-soled shoes, driving hard across polished hardwood. I could picture my son, with perfect clarity, in that immaculate glass-walled office, pacing back and forth like a cornered animal. The rapid, uneven rhythm of his footsteps broadcast a level of raw panic he had managed to conceal entirely during our phone call. He was scared through to his bones. Then came the distinct sound of ice striking the side of a heavy crystal glass, followed by liquid poured quickly. He was fixing himself a drink, almost certainly a heavy pour of whiskey, reaching for chemical courage at an hour when most people were barely on their first cup of coffee. The pacing continued, growing faster and less even until the heavy office door swung open again. "Have you lost your mind?" a voice snapped. It was Renee. Every trace of the artificially sweet, public-facing concern had been stripped away. What remained was sharp, venomous, and dripping with raw contempt. "It is barely 6:00 in the morning, and you are wearing a groove into the floor while drinking scotch. Pull yourself together before you blow this for both of us." "I am blowing this," Garrett fired back, his voice cracking on a high, desperate pitch I had never once heard from him. "Are you actually listening to yourself, Renee? I just committed a significant federal felony. I forged my own father's signature on a legally regulated document. I sold his primary residence right out from under him. Do you fully grasp the magnitude of what we have done? We did not simply borrow money from a friend. We committed clear, undeniable real estate fraud." I closed my eyes and let his full, uncoerced confession settle over me. The deep satisfaction of hearing him admit it aloud was real, but it was rapidly overtaken by the sheer desperation saturating his every word. "Keep your voice down." Renee hissed the words, slicing through the air like a blade. "Do you want the entire floor to hear you? The deed is filed, Garrett. The paperwork went through. The eviction notice was served and your father accepted every word of it. Right now, he is packing his things into cardboard boxes, thoroughly convinced his mind is slipping away from him. We hold all the cards here. Stop behaving like a frightened boy and start behaving like a man who actually wants to get out of this alive. Survive. Garrett threw back the clink of his glass, making clear his hands were shaking. We are going under Renee. I just raided my own father's pension. I wired $39,985 out of his personal retirement account yesterday afternoon just to cover 1 month's interest on your leveraged debt. I wiped out the entire savings he spent 40 years building at that manufacturing plant. All of it just to buy us a few extra days of breathing room. We have crossed a line here. We are completely out of control. This is not aggressive financial maneuvering anymore. This is serious criminal conduct. If anyone examines those transfer logs closely, if anyone challenges that fraudulent power of attorney, I am the one who will be standing in front of a federal judge. Everything has my name on it. I could be looking at 20 years. I sat perfectly still in the darkened study, my black coffee going cold in the mug beside me. The raw audio was confirming word by word everything Claudette's forensic team had meticulously assembled. Garrett understood completely the legal danger he was in. He knew the full weight of what he had done. He was conscious of the fact that he was actively dismantling his own father's life to preserve his own. And yet the engine driving his panic was not genuine moral anguish. It was not any real reckoning with what it meant to fail his father. It was the suffocating, paralyzing terror of being caught. He was mourning the potential loss of his own freedom, not the loss of his father's dignity. A stretch of silence opened up on the feed, broken only by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. I waited for Renee to offer something, even a hollow reassurance, to steady her unraveling husband. Instead, what she delivered was so profoundly cold, so emptied of basic human feeling, that it sent a chill moving through me. "You listen to me very carefully, Garrett," she said, her voice dropping to a low, controlled whisper that carried the full weight of a threat. "You can stand there and grieve your father's $40,000 pension all you want. You can feel guilty about a house he is too old to keep up anyway. But you seem to be conveniently forgetting exactly who we are dealing with." The pacing stopped entirely. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the office. "We are sitting on $2.5 million in debt." She continued, driving the reality of it into him without mercy. "And we do not owe that money to a patient national bank. We do not owe it to a sympathetic venture capital firm that will cheerfully restructure our terms over a lunch meeting. We owe it to a highly organized, completely unregulated private syndicate operating out of Detroit. Do you understand what that actually means? They do not care about your guilt. They do not care about your father. They care about their money." I heard the deliberate click of her expensive heels as she moved closer to him across the floor. "They gave us exactly 10 days, Garrett," she whispered, and for the first time her own voice carried the unmistakable edge of genuine fear. 10 days to put $1 million in liquid cash in their hands, or they have explicitly promised to send men directly to this apartment to take it out of us physically. They will not mail us notices. They will break our legs, Garrett. They will shatter our knees, and they will strip away absolutely everything we have left. So you can dry your eyes, close the sale of your father's house by Monday morning, and hand them their money. Or you can wait for men who will put you in a wheelchair for whatever is left of your life." The audio feed went silent, save for the thin, steady sound of Garrett's terrified breathing. He was completely boxed in, pinned between the threat of federal prosecution on one side and the immediate physical promise of a violent criminal syndicate on the other. The nature of what I was listening to had shifted entirely. This was no longer a straightforward story of a greedy son stripping a suburban house away from a trusting old father. This had become a desperate fight for survival inside a dangerous and unforgiving criminal underworld. I slowly lifted the headphones from my ears and set them down on the wooden desk. I eased back in the chair and let the full dimensions of their situation wash over me. My son had bargained his soul for a fabricated image of wealth, and the debt had finally come due. They were genuinely terrified, scrambling frantically against a Monday deadline imposed by violent men who did not negotiate. They needed the equity from my home to literally purchase their own physical safety. A slow, dark smile settled across my face. They needed my house to survive. They needed the quiet, total surrender of a confused old man to save their own legs. I lifted the coffee mug and took a long, unhurried sip. The bitter liquid anchored me cleanly in the moment. The trap was fully set. The timeline was locked in, and I held complete power over whether the syndicate would tear them apart piece by piece or not. I remained perfectly still in the dim study, the heavy leather headphones resting on the desk in front of me. The initial shock of learning the full scale of their debt to the Detroit syndicate had briefly numbed everything, but the audio feed from their penthouse was nowhere near finished. I rested my hand against the cold ceramic surface of the coffee mug, needing something solid and real beneath my fingers. Through the static-free connection, the sounds coming out of their luxurious living room assembled themselves into a vivid picture in my mind. The frantic pacing had gone still. The silence that settled in its wake was dense with unspoken tension. A brief lull in a conversation that was coming apart at the seams. I took a slow, measured breath and waited for the next inevitable crack in their crumbling front. Garrett was the first to break the quiet. His voice sounded hollowed out, scraped clean of its usual corporate polish. "Okay?" Garrett said, his tone wavering under a sickening blend of fear and exhaustion. "Okay. We have the house equity coming in. We have the $40,000 from his pension account. We can get the syndicate their initial $1 million by Friday. But what about the rest of it? Renee, what about my father?" The lawyer gave him 72 hours. The movers are locked in for Monday morning. We still have to pay for his medical transition. Those premier assisted living facilities want massive deposits up front, and we just redirected his entire pension to cover your margin interest. How are we supposed to fund his care package now? I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, my whole body going rigid in anticipation of her answer. I fully expected Renee to propose another fraudulent loan, or perhaps liquidating whatever scraps they had left to cover my placement in some modest state-run facility. What I heard instead was a sound I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Renee laughed, not a nervous laugh, not a bitter, hollow chuckle wrung out by the pressure of their circumstances. It was a cold, clean, genuinely amused sound that rang out across their expensive hardwood floors. It was the laugh of a predator admiring the elegance of its own trap. "A premier assisted living facility," Renee repeated, her voice soaked in deep, unfiltered mockery. "Are you seriously still holding on to that script, Garrett? That was the story we fed your father to keep him cooperative. That was the medical narrative we handed to Conrad Haskell, so the lawyer would feel comfortable drafting the eviction notice. Do you honestly think I would spend a single dollar of our remaining capital on a luxury retirement suite for that old man?" "Then where is he going?" Garrett demanded, his voice climbing with sudden panic. "Renee, the movers are bringing a transport vehicle on Monday. We told him he was going to a care facility. Where did you actually tell the transport drivers to take him?" "I found a place." Renee stated, her tone startlingly calm. The casualness of it hit me like something physical. "It is not a premier facility, Garrett. It is not even a registered medical clinic. It is an unlicensed, off-the-grid hospice compound located about 10 miles north of the Mexican border. I wired a non-refundable deposit of exactly $2,000 to the property manager through an encrypted offshore account. That leaves us $38,000 from his pension to put toward the Detroit syndicate. Your father is not going to a luxury resort, Garrett. He is going to a warehouse. A warehouse. Garrett stammered, the horror finally bleeding into his voice. Renee, what are you actually saying? He needs daily meals. He needs basic supervision. If the authorities look in on him, if anyone from the state investigates his living conditions, they will trace it straight back to us. You cannot just abandon him in an unlicensed building. Nobody is going to look in on him, Garrett. Renee replied, her voice settling into a chilling flat register. It is a black hole. No registered doctors on staff. No state oversight of any kind. No official visitor logs, no medical records. The people who operate this place exist specifically to serve families who need their elderly relatives to vanish quietly without generating any legal footprint. They take the patients in, they lock the doors, and they aggressively over-medicate them to keep them sedated and manageable. Around the clock. 24 hours a day. I stopped breathing. The air inside my study suddenly felt as thick and heavy as standing water. I stared blankly at the glowing monitor, my mind straining to absorb the absolute undiluted evil pouring through the headphones. They were not simply taking my money. They were not only stealing my home. They were deliberately sending me toward a slow, silent end. At his age, Renee continued smoothly, entirely unmoved by the monstrous logic of her own words. With the physical stress of the eviction compounded by heavy chemical sedation, his heart will give out in under a month. Probably considerably sooner. It is a biological certainty. And when it happens, the facility will quietly dispose of the remains. No formal autopsy. No official police inquiry. No one will ask any questions, Garrett. The problem resolves itself, and we are free to liquidate the balance of his estate to pay off the Detroit lenders. The audio feed hissed softly in my ears. I waited for my son to erupt. I waited for Garrett to violently reject this conspiracy, to draw a final moral line in the dirt, and tell his wife that he would not be party to his own father's premeditated murder. A month, Garrett whispered instead. His voice was completely emptied of anger. There was no outrage, no revulsion, only a quiet, sickening acquiescence. Are you absolutely certain there is no paper trail? Are you sure the transport drivers will not talk? The drivers are private contractors, Renee assured him, her voice as flat and cold as poured concrete. They are paid in untraceable cash to move cargo, not to ask questions. Your father will get into that car on Monday morning, and that will be the very last time we ever have to think about him. I reached up with hands that were not entirely steady and pulled the headphones from my head, setting them down heavily on the wooden desk. The mechanical ticking of the antique mantel clock in the hallway seemed deafening now, a relentless countdown to a scheduled execution. The shape of this conflict had changed completely. I was no longer a retired engineer contesting a fraudulent property deed. I was a man fighting for his survival against two cold-blooded predators who had reduced his death to a line item in a financial recovery plan. They had dissolved every last boundary of human decency. I got to my feet, my heart cold, and my resolve hardened to something beyond steel. I studied my own reflection in the dark monitor, a face staring back at me with eyes that no longer had any room in them for mercy. The phase of quietly gathering evidence was finished. As my hand moved toward the heavy black receiver to cut the connection, a sharp crack of static broke from the headphones lying on the mahogany desk. I stopped. My fingers hovered just above the power dial. The ambient texture of their living room had shifted the background hiss, replaced by a taut, loaded silence that told me the conversation still had more to give. driven by some grim, compulsive need to hear how far down their depravity actually ran. I picked the headset back up and pulled it over my ears. Garrett was speaking again. His voice much quieter now, the frantic energy drained out of it, replaced by a hollow, trembling uncertainty. He was moving slowly near the massive glass window of his office, his breath catching in uneven intervals. "Renee." He whispered the sound, barely reaching the hidden microphone. "We do not have to take it this far. We can simply take the equity from the house sale. The property will clear more than enough to pay the Detroit syndicate their initial $1 million by Friday afternoon. We give them exactly what they are demanding right now, and we find a standard basic care facility for my father, a state-run place cheap, but somewhere he is reasonably safe. We do not need to send him to a border compound to die in a dark room." The silence that answered his plea was heavy and suffocating. I heard the faint clink of ice against crystal as Renee moved closer to him. "You are incredibly naive, Garrett," she said, her tone stripped of any trace of marital warmth or basic human feeling. "You are standing in front of a burning building trying to calculate the price of a fire extinguisher. The $1 million we hand the syndicate on Monday morning is nothing more than a good faith deposit to stop them from breaking our legs. It buys us time. It does not buy our freedom. We still owe them another $1.5 million in principal plus a weekly VIG compounding at a rate that does not forgive. The house equity barely covers the initial blood money. Once the bank takes its share and the remaining local creditors take theirs, we are left with nothing. We lose this penthouse. We lose the imported cars. We are finished entirely." Garrett let out a muffled, pathetic sob that carried clearly across the audio feed. "But sending him down there," he stammered, his voice fracturing under the weight of what he was saying, "knowing exactly what they do, knowing how they over-medicate them until their hearts stop. Renee, what you're describing isn't a financial crime. The moment any investigator pulls that thread, we are looking at a murder charge. I cannot carry something like that. I cannot sit here staring at these walls, bracing for a call, telling me my father is gone. A phone call isn't what you'll be waiting for." Renee answered, her voice moving across the encrypted feed with the smooth, bloodless composure of something predatory. "What you'll be waiting for is a very specific, very large sum of money." My hand locked around the edge of the wooden desk. Her words settled over me like a chemical fog. "What does that mean?" Garrett demanded, confusion and dread tangling in his voice. 6 months back, Renee began, her tone carrying the dark satisfaction of someone unveiling a masterwork. I watched our commercial real estate margins go into freefall. I understood immediately that we needed a failsafe no one would ever see coming. So I located a private broker who handles the kind of underwriting most institutions won't touch. Then I took the forged power of attorney, paired it with a completely fabricated stack of medical documentation, and used all of it to bind a comprehensive life insurance policy around your father's life. Garrett's breath caught so violently it distorted the microphone. "A life insurance policy," he repeated in a barely audible whisper. "How large?" $5 million, Renee said. The number dropped into the room with an almost physical weight. "The policy is airtight, but it carries one very rigid condition tied to his age and his supposed medical history. A natural death inside a licensed care facility triggers an immediate no-questions payout. That is the entire reason we are not placing him in some government-regulated nursing home where doctors might want to keep him alive or raise uncomfortable concerns. That is the entire reason I sourced the underground border hospice. The outcome there is guaranteed and leaves no trail. The chemical regimen will put enormous strain on his heart within a matter of weeks. The facility generates a clean, routine death certificate. We file the paperwork, the insurer transfers $5 million directly into our offshore account, and the Detroit syndicate becomes a memory. We retire the $2.5 million we owe and use what remains to quietly reassemble everything we've lost. The full horror of what she had engineered crashed into me like something solid and fast-moving. This was not a theft. This was not two desperate people making a reckless gamble and cutting me loose as collateral. They had sat down, drawn up a plan, and written my death into the budget as a line item. Renee had assigned a dollar value to whatever time I had left $5 million, and was executing against that number with the same detached precision she would bring to closing a property deal. I sat there rigid, every nerve focused on my son, waiting for the moment he pushed back. I kept listening for the version of Garrett I had raised, the boy who knew right from wrong, to surface and refuse. Instead, what I absorbed through those headphones was the sound of that boy dissolving. His breathing was ragged, uneven. Beneath it, barely audible, was the grinding noise of a conscience giving way. $5 million, Garrett murmured, drawing the words out. The tremor in his voice wasn't horror anymore. It was arithmetic. Sick, desperate arithmetic. That number wipes everything out. The syndicate, the mortgages, the credit lines gone. All of it. Every last bit of it, Renee confirmed, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. The slate is clean. But you have to keep steady, Garrett. You load him into that transport van Monday morning, and you do not allow yourself to glance backward. Silence stretched across the feed. I pressed my eyes closed and aimed something that might have been a prayer at whatever indifferent force governs this world, asking it to let my son be better than this moment. He wasn't. When Garrett spoke again, the shaking was gone. Every trace of conflict had been burned away, leaving something flat and hollow in its place. "Okay," he said quietly. "We send him to the border." I pulled the headphones free and set them on the desk. Whatever thread of fatherly feeling had survived to that moment was severed cleanly and completely. There was no grief in it. It was simply over. I was not a victim in this room. I was something else now. I sat with the silence of the study around me. The darkness felt weighted, distorted, a physical reflection of how thoroughly my world had been remade. My son and his wife were not people who had made a terrible mistake under pressure. They had deliberately engineered my murder and priced it out to the dollar. They were planning to load me into a vehicle, deliver me to a facility near the border, and wait for a wire transfer while my heart stopped. Any other man in my position picks up the phone and calls the police. He hands over the recordings, names the conspirators, and trusts the system to answer. But I had stopped being that man somewhere during the last few minutes of that audio feed. The legal machinery would grind forward, yes. It would also give them lawyers' delays and the opportunity to stand before a jury wrapped in manufactured sympathy. They would frame themselves as victims of pressure and circumstance. I was not about to hand them that stage. They had reduced my existence to a transaction. I intended to respond in kind. I drew the satellite encrypted phone across the desk, powered it up, and put a call through to Claudette Pereira. The connection opened at once, cutting past standard international routing entirely. "Walter." Claudette's voice was sharp and alert despite the hour. "My team is still working through the commercial real estate records. The damage is worse than we first estimated. The further we get into Renee's margin positions, the uglier the exposure becomes." "The exposure no longer concerns me, Claudette," I said. My voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very still. "What happened tonight changes everything." I pulled an encrypted audio feed out of their penthouse. Renee took out a $5 million life insurance policy against my life using my own forged signature. Monday morning, they intend to move me into an unlicensed facility near the southern border and keep me sedated until my heart fails, all to collect that payout and square their debt with the Detroit syndicate. The line held nothing for a long moment. When Claudette came back, the measured professional tone had been stripped away. What replaced it was anger, precise and cold. "Walter, I'm reaching out to the FBI right now. I have a direct line into the regional directorate. They can be sitting across from Garrett and Renee in Federal Holding before morning." "Stand down," I said. "No authorities. This stays with me. I need you to pull your forensic team off Renee's real estate wreckage entirely," I told her. "Point every resource you have at the Detroit Syndicate. You confirmed earlier they're carrying $2.5 million in debt against my son. I need your people to locate whoever physically holds those promissory notes and open a back-channel conversation." A brief pause. "Walter, those aren't business associates. They function outside every regulatory boundary that exists. These are violent people." "Oh, I know precisely what they are," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Which is exactly why this works. Operators like that have no patience for installment plans from a struggling executive when a single lump payment is sitting on the table. Liquid cash in hand will always beat a slow bleed. Pull authorization for a direct wire from the core accounts of the Merit Trust. You're going to deploy my own capital to acquire my son's debt." "You're paying off what they owe," Claudette said, and for the first time genuine bewilderment cracked through her composure. "To protect them?" "Not to protect them, Claudette. To own them. Buy the debt, but do it correctly. Secure the actual promissory notes through proper legal transfer. Move the full $2.5 million obligation out of the Detroit Syndicate's hands and into a private holding entity that answers solely to me. The syndicate receives their cash and walks away having signed over every scrap of leverage they carry against my son." A slow exhale came through the line as the architecture of it assembled itself in her mind. "You want to be the one holding the blade," she said quietly. "What I want," I told her, "is to own the axe already in motion above their heads. How quickly can your intermediaries execute the transfer and lock down the paperwork? A full lump sum buyout at that level. They'll move the moment the funds clear," she said, the familiar precision returning to her voice. "I'll push the money through 3 separate shell entities, so the source stays completely buried. As far as the Detroit lenders are concerned, a larger and more aggressive operation simply absorbed their position. Digital contracts and wire transfer, I can have both done inside an hour." "Then do it," I said and cut the line. I stayed in the dark, with only the glow of the monitor in front of me watching its digital clock advance. Each minute arrived slowly carrying its own dense and merciless weight. I let myself picture it. The men in Detroit jolted awake by a notification that their $2.5 million headache had been dissolved overnight by some nameless corporate buyer. I pictured the digital signatures landing one by one my son's crushing debt, migrating out of the hands of a criminal organization and settling squarely into mine. I refilled my coffee cup. The liquid was the same shade of black as whatever had replaced the paternal feeling in my chest. Outside the window, the neighborhood was stirring completely blind to the seismic redistribution of power taking place behind my blinds. I wasn't tired. The adrenaline of an absolute irreversible betrayal had recalibrated everything inside me. I kept hearing Garrett's voice, that sick, exhaled relief when he agreed to have me killed. He believed he had threaded an impossible needle. He believed discarding his old father was the shrewdest move he'd ever made. 2 hours later, the satellite phone buzzed against the desk. I picked it up before the second vibration. "It's done," Claudette said. There was a quiet, dark satisfaction underneath the words. The wire went through without a hitch. The Detroit Syndicate took the buyout and never asked a single question. They've signed over the physical promissory notes and every piece of digital leverage to our anonymous holding company. They are gone from the equation entirely. Garrett and Renee no longer carry any obligation to the criminal underworld. Every dollar of that $2.5 million debt now runs directly back to me. They are required to produce the first $1 million installment by Monday morning, or the holding company is fully entitled to trigger immediate catastrophic asset seizure. I thanked Claudette and put the phone down. The transformation was complete. The bewildered old man who had been folding his life into cardboard boxes, he was gone. The helpless father absorbing blow after blow from an ungrateful child, gone. What remained was the architect. I now held the legal and financial machinery capable of dismantling everything they had built brick by brick. They were planning to walk through my front door Monday morning and take my home. They were planning to end my life. I looked at the glowing monitor and allowed myself a thin, cold smile. I was going to let them come. I was going to let them stroll in wearing their victory like a tailored coat, and then I was going to bring the blade down directly on their necks. The morning of the 72nd hour broke clear, the sky painted in long, clean strokes of early light. I stood at the bay window and watched the glow spread slowly across the lawns. Monday. Precisely 8:00 a.m. The stillness cracked open when a large commercial moving truck ground its way up the street and stopped hard in front of my driveway. The engine shuddered and died. The air brakes released with a hiss that carried through the glass. A sleek silver sedan pulled up behind it along the curb. Garrett climbed out from the driver's side, sharp business suit, shoulders back every inch, the picture of a man who believed he had already won. Renee stepped out from the passenger side, clutching her designer bag, her face locked into an expression of grim, purposeful annoyance. Then a third vehicle arrived, Conrad Haskell. The compromised attorney they had engaged to push the fraudulent property transfer across the finish line. He retrieved a polished aluminum briefcase from the back seat, worked his tie into place with the self-satisfied precision of a man who had never once questioned his own cleverness. The three of them gathered on the sidewalk and exchanged low, quick words. They were utterly certain of what they were walking into: a frightened old man surrounded by moving boxes, already beaten, waiting to be quietly loaded into a van headed for an unmarked end. I stepped away from the window and moved to the full-length mirror in the hall. I was not wearing the faded flannel that had become my daily armor of invisibility. I had dressed instead in a perfectly tailored midnight navy suit, woven from imported English wool, a garment I had kept sealed in a cedar closet like a weapon in reserve. I set the knot of my deep cobalt silk tie and adjusted the collar until it sat exactly right. I fastened a vintage platinum watch around my left wrist and felt its familiar weight settle there, the weight of a man who still owned himself. The frail pensioner they had outmaneuvered existed only in their imagination. I walked down the hallway to the living room. Claudette Pereira was already there, having come in through the rear entrance an hour earlier. She'd brought two men with her broad-shouldered, unhurried, dressed in dark suits that hung open just enough to put their federal law enforcement badges in plain view. They stood without speaking behind my leather recliner, their presence filling the room with a quiet, crushing authority. Claudette stood alongside them, a sleek silver tablet in hand, her expression sealed into professional neutrality. I poured a cup of black coffee, carried it to the recliner, and settled in with my legs crossed. The staged moving boxes near the window completed the scene perfectly, a small piece of theater, to make them feel for one final moment that everything was going according to their plan. We sat in silence. Less than 2 minutes passed before I heard the metallic bite of a key entering the front lock. The heavy door swept inward and knocked against the rubber stop. Garrett came through first. His shoulders were set and squared, already loaded with commands. Renee was right behind him, one hand already fishing a sanitized surgical mask from her purse, as though she were stepping into a contamination zone. Conrad Haskell followed at the rear, polished aluminum briefcase in hand, prepared to produce fraudulent eviction paperwork for any official who might raise an eyebrow. Dad! Garrett's voice rang through the foyer, loud, clipped, stripped of every tremor I'd heard on those recordings. The moving crew is outside. We need you ready now. Your transport to the medical facility arrives in 20 minutes, and there's no room for delays. He turned the corner into the living room and stopped so suddenly his dress shoes skidded on the hardwood. Renee walked straight into his back and let out a sharp noise of irritation before she looked past him. Then she saw the room. Her eyes went wide, not surprised something closer to physical impact. The confident momentum that had carried both of them through that front door evaporated on the spot. They stood locked in place, unable to move, staring at a scene their minds had no framework to process. I didn't move from the recliner. I raised the coffee mug, took a slow sip, and watched them over the rim. No greeting. No expression beyond a steady, unhurried gaze. I gave them the full weight of the silence. Conrad Haskell, oblivious to the shift that had already occurred, pushed past my frozen son and strode into the center of the room. He made a show of hoisting a thick stack of legal documents into the air. Mr. Merritt," he announced, his voice layered with the condescension of a man performing for an audience he assumed was already defeated. "In accordance with the 72-hour eviction notice delivered to you on Friday, you are legally required to vacate these premises at once. Title to this property has been duly transferred, and your right of occupancy is extinguished. Failure to comply will compel me to contact the county sheriff to remove you for criminal trespass." I set the mug down softly on my knee. I looked at the attorney and let the silence breathe for one more second before I let the smile arrive just barely at the very edges of my mouth. "You are more than welcome to make that call, Mr. Haskell," I said. My voice came out even and low, carrying the kind of quiet that fills a room. "Though I suspect the two gentlemen standing behind me may spare you the effort." Haskell stopped waving his papers. His gaze moved past me. The moment his eyes found the federal badges catching the light, the performance collapsed. The color left his face as if a drain had been opened somewhere below his collar. Garrett hadn't moved from the archway. He was staring at my suit, the cut of it, the fabric, his jaw fractionally loose, while his mind tried to reconcile the defeated old man he'd planned for with the figure sitting in front of him. Renee's eyes had gone to Claudette. One look at Claudette and Renee understood the precise species of trouble she was facing. "Arrête," I said, pulling my gaze away from the attorney and settling it on my son. "You look like a man who wasn't expecting this. Did you genuinely believe I would spend whatever days I had left sedated in some unlicensed facility near the Mexican border compound? Did you think I'd simply allow myself to be chemically walked into the ground so you could file for a $5 million life insurance payout?" Garrett lurched backward as though the words had connected physically. His shoulders found the wall. His breathing went short and fast and shallow, the breathing of a man whose exits have all been sealed. He knew. He could see it in my face. The recordings existed, and I had heard every word. Renee began to shake. Her designer bag slipped from her fingers and struck the floor. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain yourselves," I said, and my voice carried no heat whatsoever, only the flat, absolute zero of a man who has already decided. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture, and it pressed down on all three of them like something structural giving way. Garrett's mouth came open, but whatever he intended to say dissolved before it reached air, struck dumb by the full, terrible weight of how badly he had miscalculated. Renee edged backward until her shoulders found the drywall, pressing herself flat against it, as though the wall might absorb her if she pushed hard enough. But neither of them was my primary target in that moment. I turned my head slowly and fixed my attention on the third man in the room, Conrad Haskell, the attorney who had cheerfully engineered every legal piece of this murderous scheme. The smug confidence that had been sitting on his face like a permanent fixture dissolved in an instant. What replaced it was a pale, clammy terror. His eyes jumped from the federal badges to the eviction documents trembling in his own grip, and he understood with sudden clarity that he had walked himself directly into a legal wood chipper. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket, produced a folded manila envelope, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table between us. It landed with a hard, flat crack against the surface. All three of them flinched at the sound. I have no interest in listening to fabricated explanations, I said, my voice carrying the measured, unshakable weight of a judge reading a final verdict. I already know precisely what each of you has done. I let my gaze rest on the attorney. Mr. Haskell, let's start with your portion of this arrangement. You drafted the fraudulent power of attorney. You filed the illegal property transfer. You notarized the documents declaring me mentally incompetent and signing the rights to my home across to my son. You pressed your state-issued seal onto that paperwork, formally certifying that I appeared in your downtown office last Tuesday and voluntarily surrendered my estate. I nodded toward the envelope on the table. Open it, Conrad. Take a look at what my associates put together over the last 24 hours. Haskell swallowed his throat, working visibly above his tightened tie. He stepped forward on unsteady legs and bent to retrieve the envelope. His damp fingers fumbled the clasp before he finally managed to pull out the contents. He stared down at a spread of high-resolution photographs and dense, organized stacks of printed data. Those are certified flight manifests, GPS tracking coordinates, and date-stamped photographs from a private fishing charter operating out of Juneau, Alaska. I told him, watching the color continue to leave his face. Specifically, they document the whereabouts of the notary public whose personal signature and state seal you borrowed for your fraudulent paperwork. The man who supposedly witnessed my signature last Tuesday was on a boat more than 3,000 miles away, completely out of cellular range with no knowledge whatsoever that you were putting his stolen credentials to use. Haskell stumbled backward, as if the photographs had burned him. The stack of papers broke free from his grip and scattered across the carpet in every direction. You made a catastrophic miscalculation, Conrad, I said, leaning forward in the recliner and holding his panicked stare. You assumed you were dealing with a frightened retiree who lacked both the means and the will to scrutinize your paperwork. You assumed an illegal property seizure dressed up as a routine elder care transfer would sail through unexamined. I paused to let that land. But forging a notary seal to carry out the unlawful seizure of a physical asset is not a minor procedural lapse. It is a serious federal crime. Add in the unauthorized movement of my pension funds that you helped redirect to cover your own fees, and you have stepped squarely into federal wire fraud territory. And given my age, your conduct falls under elder abuse statutes of the most severe kind. You participated knowingly in a coordinated criminal conspiracy aimed at destroying my life. The two federal agents behind me chose that moment to step forward. They moved out from the shadow of the hallway, and their physical presence instantly reorganized the entire room. The taller of the two, broad across the shoulders, his face set in a grim, immovable expression, let his hand settle onto his utility belt. Mr. Haskell. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that left no space for interpretation. We have reviewed the preliminary evidence assembled by Mr. Merritt's legal team. Expedited warrants have been secured to freeze your personal accounts, seize your electronic devices, and conduct a full audit of your practice. You are looking at a federal mandatory minimum of 15 years complete professional disbarment and the permanent demolition of everything you've built. The mask of Conrad Haskell, confident attorney, did not crack. It shattered outright. The polished aluminum briefcase fell from his hand, and struck the hardwood with a crash that seemed to echo the collapse happening inside him. His knees gave way beneath him, and he went down onto the Persian rug chest, heaving in rapid, uncontrolled bursts. He didn't look at Garrett. He wouldn't even glance at Renee. In the span of a few seconds, he had thrown his own clients overboard without a moment's hesitation. "Please!" he begged, thrusting both trembling hands upward toward the agents, his voice shrunk down to a thin, pitiful whine. "You have to understand, I didn't know the full extent of what they were planning. I was handling paperwork, that's all. Garrett told me this was a standard family arrangement, that his father was seriously ill and needed immediate placement. I can give you everything. I have encrypted emails, saved messages, a private ledger I kept of their communications. I'll testify against both of them right now. I'll hand over the entire paper trail, every piece of it. Please. I'm asking for full federal immunity. Don't take my license. Don't put me in prison. I'll tell you everything about their debts, the syndicate, all of it." I watched the man who had walked in here with a briefcase full of arrogance now weep openly on my living room floor, groveling for mercy he had done nothing to earn. I looked down at him with a contempt so cold it had passed through anger entirely. I had spent my working life constructing something honest, a legacy built from genuine effort, quiet discipline, and a stubborn refusal to take shortcuts at someone else's expense. I had operated on the assumption that most people at their core honored the same basic contract. But watching this creature collapse on my carpet, bargaining away his clients without a flicker of conscience, I understood something I had perhaps always suspected: there are people in this world who are simply predators, content to feed on whoever appears too weak to fight back right up until the moment they discover they were wrong. I settled back into the recliner and lifted my coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip and looked down at him the way you look at something unpleasant on the bottom of a shoe. "An immunity is not something you will be receiving, Mr. Haskell," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "You built your practice by preying on the weak. Today you made the fatal error of preying upon the absolute wrong man." The 10 seconds elapsed in a silence that felt almost structural, thick enough to lean against. Conrad Haskell remained folded on the Persian rug, still weeping. Garrett stood motionless near the archway, eyes vacant, his mind apparently unable to complete a coherent thought. It was Renee who moved first. The survival instinct she had spent years sharpening in boardrooms and behind closing tables kicked in hard. She pulled herself upright, smoothed the front of her silk blouse with fingers that couldn't quite stop trembling, and leveled a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Oh, you are bluffing!" she snapped, her voice pitching upward and ringing off the high ceilings. "You are a delusional old man playing dress-up. This house belongs to us. We hold the signed property deed. We have full legal and medical authority over your estate. You have nothing here, Walter. No money, no leverage, and no standing to challenge anything we've decided. You are getting into that transport van right now, or I will have these officers remove you from my property for trespassing." I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. I reached into my jacket, retrieved my phone, and tapped the screen, once pairing it with the high-end surround sound system I had installed in this room years ago. I pressed play. Renee's own voice filled the space, crisp, perfectly rendered, amplified through every speaker in the room. The audio quality was immaculate, not a syllable lost. I found a place. The recorded Renee announced, her digitized words dropping into the frozen room with the weight of stones hitting still water. "It is an unlicensed off-the-grid hospice compound located about 10 miles north of the Mexican border. They cater specifically to families who need their elderly relatives to quietly disappear." Renee recoiled, as though a whip had caught her across the face. Both hands flew up to cover her mouth. a strangled guttural sound, forcing its way past her fingers. I watched Garrett as the recording kept playing, his own hollow, cowardly voice filling the room, broadcasting his complicity to everyone present. But the recording had more to deliver. It pushed forward into the most sickening section of their scheme. Through the speakers came Renee's calm, methodical explanation of the $5 million life insurance policy, her precise, premeditated blueprint for inducing my cardiac arrest through chemical sedation, and the undisguised satisfaction with which she had planned to cash out my life to rescue their crumbling empire. The blood drained from my son's face until his skin went the color of old candle wax. His knees buckled visibly, and one hand shot out to catch the edge of the foyer table before he went down entirely. Stripped of every internal justification, his actions played back in high-definition audio, whatever remained of Garrett's conscience finally gave way beneath the weight of it. The two agents shifted behind me, hands moving to rest near their belts, bodies coiled and ready for anything sudden or desperate. I tapped the screen. The audio cut out, and a heavy, suffocating silence pressed down over the room. "You believed you were being clever," I said, my voice slicing through the quiet with a calm precision that was sharper than anger. "You decided a human life could be managed the same way you'd manage a bad line item on a balance sheet. You planned to chemically execute your own father to cover catastrophically reckless financial decisions." I paused. "You assumed I was deaf-blind and entirely without recourse." I rose slowly from the recliner, fastening the front of my jacket as I came to my full height. Something in my bearing, unhurried, absolute, registered on Garrett's face as something he had never witnessed in me before. I reached into my inner pocket and drew out a thick, folded set of legal documents. Then I crossed the Persian rug, stepping carefully around Conrad Haskell's collapsed weeping form, and came to a stop a few feet from my trembling son. "You attempted to have me killed to settle a $2.5 million debt," I said, each word placed with deliberate, merciless precision. "You forged documents, engaged corrupt legal counsel, and arranged for my body to be deposited in an unmarked grave to satisfy the demands of a Detroit lending syndicate. You believed $5 million in fraudulent insurance proceeds would zero out your ledger and buy your freedom." I lifted the documents and held them into the morning light, letting the dense columns of financial text catch it fully. "But the people you owe have changed, Garrett." He stared at the papers with the vacant look of a man watching the ground dissolve beneath him. "What are those?" he whispered, his voice reduced to a dry, fractured rasp. These are the original promissory notes," I said, dropping the stack onto the glass coffee table where it landed with a heavy, conclusive thud. "The legally binding contracts accounting for every dollar you borrowed from the Detroit underground. Early this morning, while you were still dreaming about your $5 million windfall, I directed Claudette to reach out to your lenders. I authorized my financial team to execute a full, immediate buyout of your criminal debt portfolio." Renee drew a sharp, ragged breath. Her eyes ricocheted between the documents, the federal agents, and my face. "To you, a buyout?" she stammered, her voice fracturing. "How could you possibly fund a buyout? You're a retired engineer on a fixed pension. We reviewed your accounts. We reviewed your financial records. You reviewed the profile I deliberately assembled for public consumption," I said, turning my gaze toward her pale, terrified face. "You saw the modest accounts I maintained for groceries and property taxes. What your greed was too shallow and too impatient to discover what your contempt for a supposedly helpless old man blinded you to entirely was the substantial generational wealth I have managed quietly for decades." I let the words arrive with the weight they deserved. "I am the sole primary beneficiary of a $90 million corporate trust. The capital available to me is beyond anything your calculations ever considered. Garrett made a small wounded sound, the noise of a man who has just grasped that he threw away his father's life for pennies while standing atop a mountain of gold. I used an insignificant fraction of those resources to settle the Detroit syndicate. I continued. I wired $2.5 million into their holding accounts. They signed over every piece of leverage they carried against your lives without a moment's hesitation. I let the silence work before I finished. I am now your sole creditor. The loan is in default. I am exercising my full legal right to initiate immediate asset seizure, your downtown penthouse, your imported vehicles, your margin accounts. You are completely and irreversibly bankrupt. And for the documented, premeditated conspiracy to commit murder, you are both going to spend the remainder of your lives in a federal penitentiary. The totality of it struck Renee like a structure coming down on top of her. Everything she had constructed, the persona of the untouchable corporate wife, the polished certainty that she was always the most dangerous person in any room, collapsed at once. What it left behind was a cornered, terrified animal. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that rang off the high ceilings and echoed back into the room. Her legs gave way, and she went down hard onto the Persian rug, manicured hands clawing at the woven fabric as though searching for something solid to grip. The woman who had mapped out the timeline of my chemical execution, with the composure of someone scheduling a business lunch, was now a sobbing, hyperventilating wreck on my living room floor. She did not look at me. There was no remorse in her expression, only a vicious, cornered fury aimed entirely at her husband. Her tear-streaked face swung toward Garrett, eyes blazing. This is completely your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking apart on every syllable. "You told me he was just a clueless old man. You swore to me this would be clean and simple. You dragged me into this financial disaster. You made me part of this plan. I never wanted anything to do with your pathetic family, Garrett. You did this." Garrett didn't turn to face her. His entire world had been inverted in the space of a few minutes. He looked at the promissory notes on the coffee table, then at the federal agents behind my chair, then at my face. The moment he fully understood that he had unknowingly placed his own neck into my hands finished him completely. He went to his knees. He crossed the floor between us on all fours. Every shred of composure abandoned his movements, stripped of any dignity whatsoever. When he reached me, he grabbed at the fabric covering my legs with both shaking hands and looked up. "Dad, please." His voice had collapsed into a high, desperate whimper that turned my stomach. "Dad, you cannot do this. You cannot send me to federal prison. I am your only boy." He kept going, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. I was terrified. The syndicate had their hands around my throat. They were going to take everything, maybe worse. I panicked. I made a catastrophic mistake. But I am still your flesh and blood. Please look at me. I am your son. Give me a second chance. I will pay you back every single cent. Just please do not let them take me away. I stood over the man clutching my legs and allowed myself one involuntary second, a single flash of something older. A small, bright-eyed boy in this very driveway, a bicycle wobbling beneath him, my hand steady at his back, a promise that I would always keep him safe. That boy had been gone for a very long time. What was on the floor in front of me now was something that had replaced him. My chest felt like granite, not cold with emotion emptied of it. No pity moved through me. No hesitation stirred. I reached down, closed my hands around his wrists with a grip that visibly startled him, and removed his hands from my jacket. I stepped back and let him sink onto the rug. "You stopped being my son the precise moment you assigned a price to whatever time I had remaining," I said. My voice carried no heat, only the finality of a door being permanently sealed. You ended that bond the instant you arranged for a transport van to carry me to a border facility to be chemically put down. This was not a mistake, Garrett. It was a calculated, purely financial decision. And now you will pay the exact going rate for that transaction. I gave a single quiet nod toward the agents standing behind me. Both men stepped forward, moving with the seamless, unhurried efficiency of federal law enforcement that has performed this task many times before. The agent on the left took Garrett by his tailored collar, dragging him to his feet and pulling his arms behind his back in one fluid movement. The hard, metallic snap of handcuffs ratcheting shut rang through the living room like a closing door. The second agent moved on Renee, brushing past her hysterical resistance and locking her wrists in cold steel without a word. Conrad Haskell, still huddled in the corner, releasing quiet, broken sobs, was hauled upright by a third agent who had entered through the foyer, completing the sweep. All three secured. All three finished. I did not linger to hear Miranda rights recited. I pressed myself up from the leather recliner, drew one long, measured breath, and worked the buttons of my jacket closed. I turned away from the wreckage of what had once been my family and walked steadily toward the front door. Claudette Pereira stepped out of my path, and as I passed her, I caught the edge of something rare on her face, a quiet, composed smile carrying the full weight of professional respect. She matched my stride as we moved together out of the house. The morning sunlight was sharp and clean when I crossed the threshold. The street beyond was calm, unhurried, completely indifferent to the catastrophic unraveling that had just played out on the other side of that door. I moved past the large moving truck sitting at the curb. The two movers who had been brought in to strip the house were propped against the metal bumper with cigarettes, their expressions twisted with confusion at the ring of federal vehicles that had descended on the block. Not one glance did I spare them. I walked with my spine straight and my chin level, my dignity no longer a debt I owed anyone, fully reclaimed, fully mine. A black town car sat idling close to the driveway. The driver moved quickly to get the door open as I came near. I settled into the leather interior, drawing in the cool, quiet stillness of it. Claudette slid into the seat beside me and retrieved her silver tablet, already moving into the financial triage of my former son's shattered corporate empire. Through the tinted glass, I allowed myself one last look at the modest house where more than 30 years of my life had unfolded. It carried no pull on me now. No warmth, no memory that mattered. It was nothing but a structure, a hollow shell emptied at last of the people who had quietly engineered my death inside it. The driver put the car in gear and the town car drew smoothly away from the curb. I left that house behind without looking back. I was moving forward toward a life that belonged entirely to me again. Finally, completely, irreversibly free. People spend their whole lives describing family as the one place where they are always safe, always anchored. But a shared bloodline is not the same thing as loyalty, and love that has to be assumed is not love at all. Real respect is built deliberately through integrity and sacrifice, and the daily, unglamorous choice to honor the people depending on you. When greed displaces all of that, when the hunger for money and comfort outgrows everything else, even the deepest bonds can quietly hollow out from the inside until nothing remains but the shape of what used to be there. My son looked at my age and concluded it made me vulnerable. He looked at my silence and concluded it made me ignorant. He mistook the patience of a father for the blindness of a fool. He was wrong about all of it. The hardest thing I have ever been forced to accept is this: there are people in your life you cannot rescue. Not because the tools aren't available, but because they are not lost. They made their choice deliberately with full knowledge of what it would cost you. You cannot pull someone back from a decision they made with open eyes. Sometimes the only way to protect what remains of yourself is to stand aside and allow the weight of their own choices to find them. That is what justice looks like when you are the one who builds it with your own hands. Not a courtroom plea, not a lawyer's mercy, not a suspended sentence. The full, unbroken, irreversible consequence of what they decided to do. I had earned that, and I intended to enjoy every day of what came next. I want to thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. It is not an easy one to tell, and I suspect it was not always an easy one to hear. Looking back, what this cost me was not the house, not the money, not even the years I gave to a son who decided I was worth more dead than alive. What it cost me was the version of myself that still believed love was enough to protect a person. I believe God allowed me to lose that particular illusion so I could finally see clearly and act accordingly. The grief of that is real, but so is the freedom that came after. Here is what I want you to take with you. Never let comfort make you careless. Verify what matters even when verification feels like an insult to the people you trust. If someone is moving fast to separate you from your assets, your home or your independence, slow everything down. Urgency is a tool predators use. Document everything. A quiet record kept in private is often the only witness that cannot be bought, pressured, or silenced. And if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, betrayed, isolated, and written off as finished, remember that the people who underestimate you have just handed you the only advantage you need. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you have not yet subscribed to Dad Revenge, I would be grateful if you did. There are more stories here, and every one of them matters. Thank you, truly. Take care of yourself out there.